Quick introduction, I'm Richard Lim, CEO of Retail Economics. We're an independent economics consultancy focused on consumer and retail. So we're really excited to launch this piece of work with FreedomPay and Dynatrace that is really focused on what payment resilience means for retail and hospitality businesses in the US. So payment resilience has become such an important topic within the retail and hospitality sector at the moment. And the kinds of conversations that I'm having with C-suite leaders within the industry just shows how important it's become, and it's rising up that agenda in terms of importance. So whether it's blackouts, cyber attacks, internet downtime, payment terminal issues and failures, it's just become much more important in terms of growing risks and concerns at board level. So when we started this project a couple of months ago, what we really wanted to do is focus on answering a key question. And that key question was, how much does payment disruption cost US retail and hospitality businesses every year? And what we did is we adopted a three-pronged approach. We interviewed over 200 businesses within retail and hospitality, different sizes of businesses to represent the nature of businesses across the country. We also conducted a consumer panel of over 5,000 adults throughout the US. We wanted to understand different aspects of tolerance to payment disruptions, the use of cash, what kind of payment preferences they had. And so we focused this research across 5 of the largest consumer spending states, so California, Florida, Texas, New York, and Washington. And then finally, we wanted to build an economic model. We wanted to combine the B2B survey, the business-to-business survey, with the consumer panel survey, and then we wanted to overlay that with economic data from official third-party sources. So some of these data points came from US Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Department of Energy, and so we combined all of that to create an economic model to actually quantify the issue around payment disruptions within the country. And so when it comes to things like blackouts and power disruption, using the data from the Department of Energy, what we wanted to do is understand when the energy disruptions happened, what time of day, what day of week, what time of year, because of course power outages impact retailers at different levels of significance. So a payment disruption in the run-up to Christmas, of course, is much more of a significant issue than a dreary Tuesday morning in February. And so we could look at the power disruptions, overlay that with retail sales and hospitality data to actually quantify the impact of these different areas. So what I intend to do this morning is cover 5 of the main insights that came out of the research. And so the big question around how much value does this actually impact across retail and hospitality is the first I will answer. What we estimate when we combine all of this data together is that payment disruption costs retail and hospitality businesses around $44.4 billion every year. And so we split this into retail and hospitality, and you can see there that we've mapped out the main impacts, the primary effects that cause this disruption, and what that potential revenue at risk figure is across those different areas. But you can see there retail accounting for the lion's share, so $37.7 billion, and the rest around hospitality and leisure. And of course, these are connected systems. So one point of failure has a cascading effect across the payment resilience network. And so this is that primary effect, but within the research, we go into much more detail about what that cascading effect actually looks like as well. What we found is that on average, US stores see payment disruptions of about 5 times a year. So it's almost once every other month a store has some kind of payment disruption. And we do see some variance within states that I'll go on to shortly, but almost 2/3 of these incidents as well actually occur during busy times. So they occur when teams are stretched, when footfall is high, seasonal demand peaks, And of course, what that means is it amplifies the impact, it amplifies the commercial impacts of these disruptions if they happen at the busiest time. Focusing on the three main areas where the risk is most concentrated, what we see is that card machine and POS reliability accounts for nearly $10 billion of that total revenue at risk, so about 23% of the total impact. So it's really important to take that into consideration of what that means around making robust hardware and rapid recovery capabilities. These are essential for businesses. We also saw the second impact around network and the internet, and so outages across network and the internet costs about 9.2 billion, and then power continuity as well. So power-related issues equate to roughly about $7.3 billion worth of that revenue at risk, and that really underlines the value of on-site backup systems to keep payments running when the grid fails. But crucially, these are not kind of isolated incidents. I talked about that cascading effect. So different terminals might be affected by different power outages, Wi-Fi, mobile ordering systems, cloud-based tools, digital tills, and all of that happens simultaneously. The second area that I wanted to focus on was that difference between different states as well. And so just a reminder, we focused on the 5 largest consumer spending states in the US. And so California, Texas, Florida, New York, Washington account for about 40% of that revenue at risk through payment disruption, despite representing about 35% of the US population. And California stands out as well. So what we saw is that in California, it accounts for about $7.1 billion of that risk, so about 16%, reflecting higher average transactions and a more heavier reliance on digital payments as well. Part of the research also focused on consumer tolerance as well. And so the quick insight here really is that consumers are not patient. And so what it shows is that consumers expect seamless and quick transactions. And if they experience some kind of payment disruption, it erodes trusts, it damages the experience, and it also damages loyalty and potential repeat business. I'll simplify the graph, but essentially what it shows, if you just focus on this line for the moment, we asked a question around, would you mind waiting? How long would you mind waiting if you had been faced by a payment disruption? And what you've got here is the proportion of people, and you've got time across the bottom. But what this shows is the proportion of people that find it acceptable to wait for this amount of time. So what we see is that at 0 minutes, 100% of people, but as we go on quickly, that tolerance level decreases really sharply. So by the time you get to about 7 minutes of waiting around, you've got about 50% of consumers that say it's not acceptable to wait that long. What you've got with this lighter blue line is the annoying but tolerable. And so this is the proportion of consumers that say, after about 5 minutes, about 25% of consumers say it's annoying but tolerable. That grows. And then the lighter blue line there shows the level of abandonment. So this is the proportion of consumers that say it's unacceptable, I'm not waiting that long, I'm going to abandon my basket and take my business elsewhere. But you can see that line grows rapidly over that period of time. And what we also see is that there's a significant gap between the level of tolerance shown by consumers and actually the time it takes to resolve payment issues. So you can see here that actually that first 7 minutes is really critical. If businesses don't resolve their payment issues within 7 minutes, that's the acceptable zone. Between 8 and 13 minutes, consumers get really frustrated. Between 14 and 23 minutes, they're abandoning their baskets at a high level, and then this is the period of point of no return where it's actually damaging to the brand. But what you see here is that their level of tolerance is quite short, and the average time that it takes for a business to resolve payment issues is about 2 hours. So 2 hours versus an acceptable limit of about 7 minutes. Another way to show this and express this is just how quickly that displacement in revenue happens over time. And so that first 7 minutes being really critical. So out that $44 billion that's lost every year, about 9% of it is lost within that 7 minutes on that kind of aggregate level. But as you get to 8 to 13 minutes, you get a steeper curve here. And so at that point, for every minute a business has not resolved its payment issues, they're losing about $1.2 billion a minute. And then you get to that zone here around the abandonment zone, but by the time you get to around 23 minutes, 65% of revenue has been displaced and lost by those businesses that can't cope. And then it flattens out, but essentially the damage is done by the time you get to that period. For businesses as well, it's really important to understand the consumer, their customers, and actually how willing they are and tolerant they are of these kinds of issues. And what we see is that there's a difference in the level of tolerance depending on many factors, depending on age, depending on income levels, depending on where these consumers live as well. And so the third insight that we saw is that we looked at the consumer panel data, we conducted a cluster analysis to segment these consumers, and what we found is that there were 4 really important consumer types that emerged because of payment disruptions. And so I'll run through this briefly, but simplify it. We've got the different personas across the top, so we brought them into 4 different persona groups, but essentially we've got high-risk critics, silent walkouts, willing workarounds, and cash-ready completers. We've got the level of tolerance here, so low tolerance to high tolerance. The payment methods, so what were their preferred payment methods between cash and digital, typical age, impact on loyalty, so if you have a payment disruption, is that going to impact your trust? So the lighter blue line shows the proportion of consumers that agree to that statement. And then you've got income, least affluent to most affluent. So what you can see here is that high-risk critics are typically higher income consumers as well. Well, what we see is that 19% of consumers are what we called cash-ready completers. They're typically older, they're typically more rural shoppers as well. They stay calmer during outages, and they're more willing to find a workaround, and they often might carry cash in order to complete their purchases. But about 19% of consumers into that cohort. We saw about 33, so about a third of consumers in that willing workaround. And so these are actually younger consumers. They might be digitally minded, and they might not necessarily carry lots of cash, but they're more willing to find a workaround. They might be more willing to walk out and try to find an ATM rather than abandon purchases. And actually they're generally more accepting and understanding of disruptions. And then what we saw is 31% the silent walkouts. To be honest, this is probably me. So this is a shopper that has low tolerance for delays. But I'm not necessarily going to shout and kick up a fuss about it. If I experience a problem, I might not wait around. I'm going to silently walk out and take my business elsewhere. I don't necessarily blame staff, but it would impact it would impact where I decide to go and shop next time. And then you've got the high-risk critics. So affluent shoppers who frequently shop in physical and online, they expect seamless payment transactions, and they react strongly when things go wrong. They're quick to blame staff, they're quick to shout about their experiences online, maybe on social media, and often they don't have the cash to complete. But I think the really important message here is that there are different levels of tolerance depending on different consumers, depending on their different backgrounds, they have different expectations, and this is really important for retail and hospitality brands to understand where their customers sit. The fourth insight is around cash is not a reliable backup anymore. And so what we see is that 8 in 10 US consumers say that credit cards and debit cards are their preferred way to pay, and that's up from about 2/3 in 2016. But over the same period, what we've seen is cash usage fall quite dramatically. So back in 2016, about 33% of transactions were conducted via cash, and that's fallen to about 15% today. So it's fallen quite rapidly. That's been displaced by more spending on debit and credit cards and contactless, but also mobile payments as well. Interestingly, when you break that down by age, we see that middle age group, that kind of typical millennial group, is the one that uses the least amount of cash. And also what we find with our own data is that there's fewer than 30% of Americans that say they always carry cash when they visit retail or hospitality venues. And that falls to 25% for millennials. We often see as well that retailers and hospitality businesses overestimate the flexibility of their customers. So actually, a lot of the comments were around retailers expecting that their customers would go out to ATM machines to find a kind of a workaround with payment disruptions, but actually only a quarter of consumers said that they would be willing to do that. We also asked businesses, so this is the fifth insight, we also asked businesses about what worries them the most during payment disruptions. And most businesses, as you'd expect, say lost revenue is their primary concern. And that was above reputational damage and also consumer trust. But I think that focusing just on the commercial aspects of payment disruptions really understates the wider impact that businesses and their staff feel. So payment failures are increasingly visible, they're increasingly emotionally charged, and it also shapes the perception of businesses as well from their consumers. What we see is that younger consumers, particularly Gen Zs and millennials, are far more likely to hold businesses directly responsible for payment disruptions. And they're more likely also to share their negative experiences as well. So tolerance is low across younger generations, but also particularly in urban and inner city locations. We also saw that brand perception is also very important, but also it doesn't necessarily take account of frontline staff and the experience of staff that are dealing with actual payment disruptions as well. So over a third of US businesses, 35%, said that they are concerned about abuse towards staff during payment disruptions. And what we also found within our research is that 6 out of 10 retail and hospitality managers report that they or their colleagues have experienced verbal abuse from customers during payment disruptions and failures. And actually, 1 in 4 can recall an incident where physical aggression has been linked to payment failure events. So really important in terms of it's just not a commercial impact, it's actually a wider societal impact as well. So what are businesses doing? So compared to other countries, the US, I would say, is slightly ahead of the curve. But what we see is that around 15% of businesses, of retail and hospitality businesses, have no secure digital backup in place, leaving them exposed when payment failures arise. When it comes to putting some of the solutions in place, what we see is that 56% support offline card processing, 51% offer mobile-based payments such as QR codes and app-based checkouts as a solution if things go offline, and also 44% have invested in secondary internet connections to keep POS systems online. So to wrap it up, what we see is quite a difference across different states. The size of the impact is significant, £44.4 billion worth of revenue at risk because of payment disruptions. It's really important to understand the customer. Customers differ in terms of their tolerance levels, and of course it's absolutely critical now for businesses to think about how to build a resilient payment system and put that in place. So really delighted now to turn to our panel. I'd welcome Chris and Philippe to take some questions. Initially, if I just ask Chris, is there anything surprising that came out of the research?
Well, there's probably several things that are surprising, right? I think for some value of the fact that businesses still have gaps for offline payments is surprising. There are providers out there such as FreedomPay that that's just a core part of our service. at this point. So I would think any of those businesses that are in that 15% gap, or even when you look at the data, right, it was only 51% that actually had offline as a ingrained failback or fallback into their system. So certainly continues to surprise me that that's a fact. Maybe the second one was that actually the lowest age demographic actually has started to exceed the next in their willingness to carry cash. And so that probably bears a little bit more explanation.
And Philippe, can I ask as well, if you look at that £44 billion that's kind of exposed, and nearly 2/3 of that happens when businesses are at their busiest, so it might be peak, it might be high levels of footfall, what does this tell you about how under-engineered most payment environments are within the US?
Yeah, I mean, payment systems are not failing in isolation. They are relying on an ecosystem of complex, applications, networks, infrastructure, and it's really difficult for teams to be able to pinpoint and detect issues and recover from them fast. And so if you look at also, things like Black Friday or a Cyber Monday, you also have very large peak volumes, and some of our customers, we've seen 80 to 100% more volume of traffic. Some of our customers were processing 1 to 2 billion transactions a day, which means that you have a complexity problem and you also have a volume problem. And if you don't recover quickly, then you will face some pretty significant business impact. And I think the research bears that out.
Yeah. And Chris, would you kind of concur with that? And does that differ for different types of businesses, depending on the sector, depending on where they see their kind of like peak demand? I think what springs to mind for me is something like toys. And so, toys and how concentrated they are all towards one part of the calendar. The kind of levels of risk for some parts of the businesses differ depending on what sector they operate in.
Look, there's tremendous variability, right? If it's not toys, it's a big stadium event where those 3 hours of operation, let's say just 15 or 20 times a year, that's quite literally the revenue that business gets. So you want to talk about an average disruption of over 2 hours at a venue that has 20 events a year and each event is only 3 hours. They just lost, whatever that maths out to be, a pretty sizable portion of their business. If you look at a lot of the franchise operators in the QSR vertical, those are businesses that are accepting and receiving payments and funding for employee salaries that they have to pay out 72 to 48 hours later. So if you were to lose that 2 hour window of your peak service time, that materially impacts your ability to pay bills in the next few days. So it just becomes so important to understand where those cliffs might be, because in addition to toys, you can have these major impacts that transcend just maybe receiving the gift of joy, all the way through to associates not being paid their paychecks because of that disruption.
It's a great kind of example, I guess, of that kind of revenue concentrated in a short period of time. And there are probably other examples of retail environments as well. But Philippe, if I can ask you, in terms of what stops organizations even knowing that something's gone wrong, and how does that affect how quickly they can act on those issues as well? They get some kind of pre-warnings to potential payment disruptions.
Yeah, I think what's really difficult for a lot of retailers is they don't have real-time visibility into this complexity that I mentioned earlier around multiple different systems talking to each other, and trying to pinpoint problems can be really difficult. But more than that, it's hard to trust automation if you don't have that visibility. And so if you want to automate with confidence, you need that real-time visibility of that entire payment flow.
Yeah. Is it realistic, do you think? We saw the kind of levels of tolerance around that 0 to 7 minutes specifically. Yeah. Do you think it's realistic if something happens for businesses to react that quickly in order to really shut down those issues and restore that confidence in their customers as well?
Yeah, I think it's realistic. I think part of the challenge, like I said, is that most organizations don't have that real-time visibility. If you do have that real-time visibility, though, it's possible to recover. It's possible to automate some flows in order to be able to make those systems resilient.
Yeah. And Chris, I touched on a bit around different customers and how they have different levels of expectations depending on, maybe that might be age or payment preferences or levels of income. And ultimately some are much more demanding than others. But do you think retailers should design their kind of payment journeys differently depending on their types of customers and their expectations around how demanding or the levels of tolerance they have around issues like this?
For some value, of course. I think every retailer should sort of look at it, almost going back to the last questions, in a bucket of three. You need an immediate fallback, an immediate identification, and an immediate remediation, right? So for some value of, fallback should be built right into that system at the point of checkout. Visibility drives an ability to identify what that is, so the Dynatrace component of that type of solution, and then remediation. Because at the end of the day, there's no merchant that's going to haphazardly qualify one of their consumers as less important than another's business, right? That's just the nature of being a merchant, is that you value all of your employees all of your consumers as regardless of the use case. So for some value of a universal need, that's a universal need. The expectation of speed of service in a sports and entertainment venue is clearly very high. You need to get through that line very quickly or you're missing the main event. Yet at a high value, high average ticket retailer, that experience is part of what you're selling. So having that have friction is no more or less acceptable than the expectation at a sports and entertainment venue, right? Think about the length of your lunch break, and you want to go to a QSR. Those minutes matter. 7 minutes on a 30-minute lunch break is very impactful. So for some value of, it's a universal issue, and everyone would look at that as an equal problem, I think.
And we saw some data around the use of cash and how that's fallen quite rapidly over the last few years. So about a third in 2016 to about 15% today. So a question for both of you, but you talk to many of your clients and you understand their issues, but how dangerous is it, a kind of a strategy, if you like, for businesses to rely on cash as that kind of fail-safe? Philip, starting.
Yeah, I think it's pretty risky. I mean, if you look at the data, 95% of Gen Z millennials are digital first. And I think you mentioned earlier, 30% or less are carrying cash with them. So it really underscores the need for resilience in those digital payment systems. I think it's really important.
Yeah, there's an additional stratification there, right? Which is, what's that average ticket? If you take a segment of the study and you say, well, 20% of consumers have cash, juxtaposed against a QSR, an average ticket of $10 or $20, that may be, survivable in some sense of the word. If we're talking about hospitality or lodging or fine dining or, retail, that statistics gets blown out of the water, and you're probably losing 95% of that opportunity just because of the size of the average ticket.
And then when we talk about the solutions for businesses, many businesses have got backup solutions. Our research showed that 15% of them don't. But from your experience, both of your perspectives, what does good look like for businesses in terms of building in that payments resilience to their strategy?
Yeah, I think I'll start.
Yeah, please.
I think obviously end-to-end visibility is super important, and be able to automate remediation, as Chris mentioned. I think boards need to ask their teams, are your systems observable? And how long does it take to detect a failure? How long does it take to remediate a failure? Those are all questions that need to be asked, because business lose a lot of money if they don't detect issues early.
It's hard to add on a lot to that. I think that's the genesis of the FreedomPay and Dynatrace partnership, is because we believe that visibility is so foundational to operating a business in a highly performant environment that's nearly a requirement for us at this point, is to really push that expectation, because it creates better vendor relationships as well. When you as a business really strongly advocate to the point of, require minimum best practices around that experience, that initial friction of such strong guidance might be there, but you're really creating the type of environment that creates the relationship that you want with those merchant partners over time.
Absolutely. Okay, and so final question for you both, but if you were to look at the research and distill it into one key message that you could deliver to a CEO of a retail or hospitality business that's probably sitting there struggling to sleep at night, thinking about all of the potential things that could go wrong, what would be your key message to deliver?
Well, when systems go down, there's a very low tolerance from the users. They don't hang around. And so it's really important that you understand the issues early and be able to recover quickly from those issues.
Yeah, I think in any business, if technology is not your core business, technology is usually the thing that you maybe don't put quite to the front of the line. And that's where I would always attempt to course correct and say, I would strongly advocate you pick your technology foundation first and then operate off of that, which would of course include things like visibility, offline, et cetera. Because what happens so much is you create this experience or this environment, or you make a fiscally sound decision, but you don't necessarily pull through the technological ramifications of that, and you try to fit that into a box. Whereas there's truly best practices out there that will mitigate a lot of what this report shows.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed that conversation. There's so much more data and insights within the full report. So the full report will be available for everyone to download. So please do download the full report. As I say, packed full of insights and strategies around how to actually kind of combat payment resilience and disruption within the industry. So thank you very much.